next speaker is Ms. Haanusia Prithivi Raj. Ms. Haanusia is a registered clinical psychologist and a clinical supervisor. She is also currently working on her PhD in health, focusing on mindfulness. She has a vast experience working with young children, adolescents, and adults with psychiatric problems. In 2015, Haanusia was awarded the Healthcare Humanity Award for establishing the first pediatric OCD service at the Institute of Mental Health for young persons with moderate to severe OCD. Today, Ms. Haanusia will be presenting on the topic, Nature versus Nurture, Risk and Protective Environmental Factors that Influence Brain Development in Children and Adolescents. May I invite Ms. Haanusia, please?
Sorry, give me a moment. Okay, hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. So I think we spend the early part of today really just learning and understanding about mental health conditions in children and adolescents. So we heard from Dr. Vic about anxiety, we heard about depression, then we learned about resilience, we learned about what makes a child resilient, a lot more resilient. We learned that, some children, especially in the age between 15 to 16, tend to be a little bit lesser with resilience, right? So in the next section, what I'll be doing is to really go through what happens with regards to child development. We'll be looking at the brain, we'll be looking at different factors that actually helps to increase or at least help a child to be more resilient. We'll be learning about different factors that actually makes it a lot harder for children to thrive. Okay, so can I trouble you first to take out your phones, and if you scan the QR code with that code to answer that question, right? So at what age do you think the brain actually reaches maturity? So would it be at 6? Sorry, do you still need the code? The code is here. The code's up there, right? Would it be at 6? Does a child's brain mature at the age of 6? Is it at 15? Is it at 18? Perhaps 25? Maybe 45? Or does our brain never mature? We'll just stay like this. I know some of you would think some people never mature, right? Yeah, so. Okay. Okay, so some of you think that at 18, right, people reach maturity, the brain's mature. A lot of us think that it could be at 25. And then there are some people who think we never ever mature. Okay, thankfully no one thinks that the brain matures at 45. But wouldn't that answer why people have midlife crisis? Right? Okay. I know I have a very short time frame, right? So yes, actually the answer is true. So our brain actually only matures, like fully matures at the age of 25, right? So which means when we deal with the children, when we deal with our kids, when we deal with the children that we see in school, they're technically not as matured as we want them to be, which raises a lot of questions, right? So yeah, so we have the results there, right? So which raises the question, if the brain's not fully matured, what can we do, right? What can we do to actually help the brain mature in the right way? And what are we doing that could actually be detrimental to the brain? Okay? So we know this is very basic. So the brain is one of the most important organ in the body, right? It plays a really important role in the way we understand things, in the way we analyze information, in our planning, in our executive skills. It plays an important role in language development, as well as our social and emotional skills, right? So these are things that we already know. But what exactly happens, right? Or when does this growth and changes happen to the brain? So very briefly, I'm not going to go into details, right? So if you look at this is it's a picture of the different areas of the brain, right? This is just to highlight how complex our brain is, right? That when we look at children, when we look at adolescents, we are actually looking at a brain that is actually still growing. And so many of these areas are not completely developed yet, right? But this is how complex the brain is, right? It's involved in analyzing information. It's involved in, making sure that we stay safe. It's involved in our fight or flight. So all these things are things that our brain's involved in. So just to talk about what exactly happens or how changes to the brain happens, right? It actually starts developing in the womb. Specifically at about 2 weeks from conception. So your brain actually starts developing from the time that the baby is in the womb, right? And a full-term baby, which is a baby who is about, born at 38 weeks onwards, is actually born with 100 billion neurons. So neurons here refer to brain cells, right? 100 billion brain cells, and those brain cells are connected by 50 trillion synapses. So synapses here refer to the connections in the brain, right? And at that point, at birth, the brain of a baby is only 25% of an adult brain. And then further growth happens. So by the time the baby is 1, the baby continues to make more connections. So a lot more learning is happening. And I'm sure those of you who would have seen babies, you would realize that within the span of a few weeks or a few months, the baby actually grows so much, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally as well, right? So they are able to go from just sitting to crawling to standing, and then they're saying things, right? So at that early age, the brain is really focused on motor skills as well as language development. Now, by the time a child is 3, the brain is almost 80% of an adult size, but it's far from being as developed as an adult brain, right? At this age, the brain is really focused on improving fine motor skills, so children are learning to use their fingers. The emotions are really wild at this point because that part of the brain is not developed yet. I'm sure you've heard of terrible twos, terrifying trees, right? Not that children are scary, but this really just means that their brain, especially the limbic part of the brain, the part of the brain that is really experiencing emotions, and the part of the brain that actually makes sense and rationalize and, for us to reason out logic, that part of the brain is not developed yet. Okay? By the time the child is about 5, now the brain is about 90% the size of an adult brain, right? Only at this age, then a child's brain is equipped enough for them to play together with someone else. So if you're expecting your 4-year-old to be social, you're expecting your 4-year-old to play together, to share. These are not skills that they already have. They are just not biologically equipped, right? So I know a lot of sharing takes a lot of limelight, especially on social media among parents. But no, children are just not biologically designed to share, at least until they are about 5 onwards. Okay? At this age, the child becomes very curious because a lot of their basic, primary, gross and motor skills have already reached those milestones. At this age, the child becomes very curious about the world. So this is where you start hearing a lot of whys. Why is the sky blue? Why is that person like this? Mommy, why is that person wearing that kind of clothes? Why do they look different from me? Right? So this is where a lot of whys happen. Now, in adolescence, so this is where it's a bit crucial, right? So with that 50 trillion synapses and 100 billion neurons that a child is born with, by the time they are in adolescent stage, they have lost a lot of it. So what happens in adolescence is that the brain actually starts pruning synapses that are not being used. So to say it simply, what the brain does is all those pathways that are not being used, all those neurons and those areas of the brain that has not been activated, that are not being tapped into, the brain actually starts losing those synapses. Right? So this is really important for us as educators, as parents, because we need to understand that if a child's growth is stunted for some reason based on the risk factors that we'll talk about later, what's going to happen is this is where, I think people asked this question earlier, right? This is where you start seeing the effects of it in adolescence, right? So when areas of the brain, when children do not get the right sort of, not just nutrients, but environmental support, it actually starts showing up later in adolescent stage. Okay. The important bit here is also to understand that the brain actually develops backwards, meaning we actually start developing from our brainstem, and then only we start developing our frontal cortex. So frontal cortex is the part of the brain that it's there, right? So that does analytical thinking, that does reasoning, that does all these logical bits, your ability to be creative. All that part is actually the last part of the brain to mature. So when we are working with adolescents as well as children, we are working with people who do not have a very well-developed frontal cortex, right? So yes, children your kids are going to be able to answer questions for you. They can memorize, right? But then what's also going to happen is that if they are very, very angry, they're not going to be able to regulate themselves really well. If they're very anxious, they might not have skills to be able to control themselves, okay? Right. So very basic stuff is that our genes provide a blueprint as to how, or when, not how, sorry, as to when your brain circuits are developed, right? So different circuits and different parts of the brain are developed at different time, and that's really informed by your gene, right? But the thing here is that your environment as well as your early childhood experiences are the ones that really influences other factors that really influence how your brain is actually formed, right? So early interaction, so the interaction that a child has with his caregivers, right? With the environment, with the grandparents, with school, those early experiences are the ones that actually shape the way the brain is. And the way the brain is at childhood, at adolescent, would be the one that actually forms and informs their trajectory of success as an adult. Right? So when we don't get this result, when we don't get a proper interaction with our environment, important neural pathways are not formed. And then remember, we have pruning, right? So these pathways are then now removed. Okay. So I'm just going to talk about risk factors as well as protective factors using these three models. So we're going to look at biological factors, psychological factors, as well as social factors that influences not just brain development, but generally child development, right? So biological factors that influences child development would be, obviously, we do know these things, things like nutrition, so all the way from conception. Exposure to toxins or infection actually influences the brain development to a certain extent. So not so much to scare you guys, but just for us to have a better understanding of some of the things that can actually influence our brain, right? So if you go back to about 7 years ago when we had the Zika outbreak, I think that's a very clear example of how that infection actually contributed to having a smaller sized brain in children who were infected, right? Or at least mothers who were infected. So biological factors that influences child development would also be family history of mental health. So mental health, unfortunately, has quite a heavy genetic loading, which means if you have, or if you're one of your children that you're dealing with actually have a caregiver or any other person in the family who has a significant mental health concern, chances are they have a higher risk of developing mental health issues. Okay? Extreme or chronic stress actually influences our brains quite a bit, right? So this could be from early childhood trauma, from neglect from our parents, or even the stress of a young child having to deal with having to look after parents, right? Sometimes we have families where parents are really unwell, or parents who are really neglectful, and then the role of responsibility of parenting actually falls on the child, right? So that affects the brain, sleep, as well as certain cognitive or developmental issues, such as conditions like ADHD, conditions like autism spectrum disorder. Those are pretty biological because children are actually born with a different sort of brain circuitry. Okay? Psychological factors, so individual risk factors, people who have a certain type of temperament tend to develop different kind of conditions when they get older, right? Thought processes, so those thought processes such as a very ruminative and negative thought process tend to also change the way your brain works, so particularly the default mode network. So the default mode network is the part of the area of the brain that is most active when we are resting. So research or science has actually shown that those who are more ruminative, those who have a more negative thought pattern, when we've done MRI studies, their brain structure looks a little bit different from those who are not as ruminative, right? Other risk factors would be, as we mentioned earlier, caregivers with mental health issues, families that are isolated. So this is an important one because I think a lot of us are living in silos, or we know people who are living in silos, right? So families who are disconnected, families who do not have support with other people. And I think this can actually spread across the different socioeconomic status. It's not just those who are in the poverty line, right? It's also those who are really affluent, who may not be very well connected to anyone else, right? So that's a risk factor. Violence in family as well as conflict, that actually influences the way brain circuits are formed. Oops, sorry. So briefly, social factors, things that we probably are familiar with, things like exposure to adversity and stressors such as poverty, lack of safety, in both home environment as well as the school, affects the way the brain affects the way the brain works, right? Lack of access to quality early education affects the trajectory of growth, actually. The bit that I want to highlight here is that exposure to adversity, a number of research has actually shown that people or children exposed to early adversities, especially poverty, or when they grow up in environments or communities with high unemployment rate, high access to drugs, high access to neighbors or, people who don't work together, what happens is that in some of the studies, they've actually found that children in this environment tend to have a smaller size brain compared to those who without these sort of risk factors, right? So the effects of this on the brain is really, I think we heard about this from Dr. Week. When we experience a lot of stress, when we are in a situation where there's just so many things going on, when we do not have a right amount, we don't have the right amount of connection, we don't have the right amount of support, what tends to happen is the body tends to be in a state of hyperarousal, where we are constantly in a state of fight or flight. So what happens when we're in a fight or flight? That's just literally, imagine you're seeing a bear in front of you, right? At that point, when you're seeing a bear, you're not going to be able to focus on your studies. You're not going to be able to think about what I want to do in life. I can't think about my values. I can't think about my goals. I can't make connection because I'm in a constant state of anxiety, right? And this constant state of anxiety contributes to emotional problems. It contributes to learning issues. So as educators, when you have children with learning issues, it's not necessarily they are dyslexic, they're dyspraxic, they have all this, they have got low IQ. It's not just that. A lot of times it's the environment. When the environment is not right, chances are the child is not in an optimal state to pay attention in class. It's not always ADHD. Sometimes it's also just too much of exposure to screen because there is no supervision at home. Right? Trauma, when children experience trauma, which can be through neglect, which can be through abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, any kind of abuse, or if the parents are constantly arguing at home, that's traumatic as well. When people experience trauma, the brain freezes. So imagine if your brain is in a state of, if it's frozen, you're not going to be able to learn new things. You're not going to be able to really absorb new information. So which then translates to difficulties in attention, difficulties in processing skills, difficulty in memories, right? We spoke about toxin exposure earlier. That affects the way your brain passes information from one part to another. Increased cortisol levels, which is basically what happens when you're very, very stressed. It affects the structural changes of your brain, right? Your brain literally looks different. And ACEs, so ACEs refer to adverse childhood experiences. So this would be things like abuse, neglect, poverty, really, really difficult situations. Or even, I assume for a lot of kids that we're dealing with, if they have lost family members through COVID, that's also an ACE, right? The thing about ACE is that it actually affects the behavioral and thought patterns, okay? So what we know about mental health is that with regards to anxiety, with regards to depression, with regards to bipolar, any kind of mental health condition, we don't just go from I am okay to, oh my God, I've got a mental health issue. No, it usually goes with increased amount of stress, right? And with this increased amount of stress, what happens is that it changes your brain chemistry. your brain doesn't produce the right amount of neurotransmitters, your hormones changes, and then this contributes to actually changes in the brain. It contributes to actually physical sort of changes that we see. Okay, this is a bit of a heavy slide, so I'm just going to pick and zoom into a few things, right? I think the one thing that really, really protects a child is a healthy connection to an adult. It doesn't necessarily have to be the caregiver, which is great if they have a good attachment with the caregiver. That's really basic. A child needs to have healthy attachment with their parents. If the parents are really not available for whatever reason, then healthy attachment with the grandparents or any other caregivers, right? Healthy attachment would then set the foundation for the child to actually grow, right? To be able to have a positive self-worth, to be able to know what or who I am, right? And that all comes from parents, and that comes from the relationship with their caregivers, right? Protective factors would be having a stable and healthy social support. So children should not grow up being really alone and being disconnected from everyone, including their extended grandparents, including family and friends, right? Relationship with a trusted or safe adult. So it can be a caregiver, it can be a grandparent, teachers, right? Extended family or any other adult, is the one single thing that really serves as a protective factor to ACEs. So remember ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences. So what a lot of studies have found is that if a child experiences ACE, but they have a trusted adult, they have that one person who thinks that they are everything, that they are amazing, that connection, that relationship with that trusted adult actually protects them from developing severe mental health issues. Okay, so family-wise, caregivers with nurturing skills and emotionally available, so not just providing basic stuff. So currently in my work, when I see a lot of young adults, what I hear from them is, hey, you know, I feel depressed, I have anxiety, I could have panic attacks, right? But I don't think I should feel this way. And then when you ask them further, they're like, no, but my parents gave me everything, you know, they gave me food, we were very well-to-do, in fact, so I don't think I have a right to feel sad. But the fact is, when the emotional needs are not met, that is going to contribute to development of mental health issues in later stage, right? So having parents who tune in to the child, being able to recognize, so making time and space to listen to the kid, listen to what's happening in school, as well as being safe and not so the relationship is not very transactional. I think we talk about that in the community. So parents who are not just focused on results, parents who are actually focusing on the relationship, that sets the child up for success. Okay, so we know we can't really escape from mental health. Everybody struggles with their mental health sometimes. What is a protective factor? Would be parents or caregivers who are actually able to seek help. So we all can get mental health issues, we all can feel stress, but what the children need to see is, are my parents able to access help? Are they able to go out and, you know, talk to someone about it? Because then that's a positive role model for them. Okay? Community-wise, access to all generation in the community. Education system, I think Prof. Wong spoke about this, right? Education system that nurtures the growth mindset. So it's not really just outcome-based. It's not just how well I do in my PSLE, how well I do in my O-levels, you know, which uni can I get into. It's not just about that. A system, so it's a systemic change that we're looking for, a systemic change that focuses on a holistic growth of the child. Okay, access to medical as well as mental health services, access to family and family-friendly policies in the community. So these are protective factors. Very briefly, I know I'm over my time. I know a lot of us are working with adolescents, so just wanted to highlight, and I think this kind of relates to what Dr. Vic mentioned earlier, as well as some points from Prof. Wong. So in early adolescence, right, so in teenage years, the decision making is usually based on emotions rather than what's right and what's wrong and what's logical. And that's really because the decision making is actually made by the limbic system. So remember the back part of the brain, right? At about 15 or 16 is when this decision making system is actually transferred from the limbic system, your amygdala, which is the fight or flight center, to the frontal cortex. right? So this is where, when that transfer happens at that age, the child is then able to make decisions that are a bit more logical. Reasoning works. They're able to recognize and understand social behaviors. Okay, I shouldn't do this because of this context, I shouldn't do this in public. And they're able to control impulsive behavior. At the same time, this is where the corpus callosum, which is the part of the brain that connects the right and left brain, it also develops further, so it allows problem solving and creative skills. Now, the implication of this is that with the amount of risk factors that a child has, if a child is exposed to an excessive amount of risk factors, then this growth is stunted, right? So it might, not that it won't happen, chances are it's not going to happen at 15 or 16. Maybe it's going to happen when they're in a much more stable, safer environment, right? A lot of the growth becomes, so remember the fact that when we are in traumatic situations or when we feel trauma, our brain's in a state of frozen state. So that just means that if we are experiencing, if your child or the children that you see in school is experiencing stress, chances are they're not going to be able to make these connections, and they're not going to do it. And a lot of times these connections do not happen until they actually feel safe, which might just be when they leave home. So just something for us to think about, okay? Yeah, so in summary, our genes are not static. They actually change with our experience in the sense that we have a gene pool and they can be off and on based on our life experiences, right? So together with all this information that we learn, I think it provides us with a lot more opportunity to think about our kids, to think about what can we do that's going to help them to reach their maximum potential. Right? So we spoke about goal, we spoke about resilience. Now we understand what sets them back. We also understand what helps them. Right? So I suppose I leave it up to you all to think about this, to ponder about this, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Haanusia, for that insightful presentation on how our brains develop and mature, and the great importance of creating optimal environments for our children to set them up for success.